We highly appreciate all of the participants who still joining us today on this conference.
On this second day, we have two incredible keynote speakers for the plenary session.
The Honorable, the first speaker, EP Dr. Surinder Kaur of University of Malaya.
The Honorable second speaker is Tri Murniati SSM Hum PhD of Universitas Jenderal Sudirman.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the plenary session will be hosted by moderator. Please welcome Rizky Februansyah, MA.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, all the committee and also our honorable keynote speakers for today's session, Mrs. Surinder Kaur, and also my colleague, Ibu Tri Murniati. We are so lucky today, in this beautiful day, we've got two beautiful superheroes who are going to deliver their presentation about the superhero in literary works. Talking about superhero, this is a very sexy and very eye-catching topic that has been explored by many researchers. In literary work, particularly in movie, my favorite superhero is Spider-Man. Why? I idolize him. Because he's very brave, cunning, and also powerful in fighting against all the crimes, all the oppression in the society. And in Indonesian context, there is a superhero junior. Probably, ladies and gentlemen, have been familiar with a boy from Aceh who had to sacrifice his life when attempting to save his mother from a villain, a heinous villain who tried to rape her. Hopefully, Rangga, a superhero junior from Aceh, now rests in peace. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, in this plenary session, we will have two outstanding speakers, as I mentioned before, Dr. Surinder Kaur and then Dr. Tri Murniati. And each of them will have around 30 minutes to deliver their presentation. And then after that, there will be a Q&A session. The first...
Bagus apa
by Surinder Kaur. Before she delivers her presentation, allow me to read her curriculum vitae. If I had to read all her CV, I think we need around 30 minutes, to finish reading her CV. But let me highlight some important points, particularly dealing with her educational background. She obtained her undergraduate and master degree from University of Malaya, Malaysia. And then she pursued her PhD, doctoral degree at Lancaster University, the UK. And then currently she is the Dean of Faculty of Languages and Linguistics. Hopefully, the superhero sitting next to me will also follow her path, will become the Dean for this Faculty of Humanities of Jenderal Sudirman University. I mean, okay. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, now we will welcome Ibu or Mrs. Surinder Kaur to deliver her presentation. Mrs. Surinder Kaur, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. A very good morning to everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. All right. Okay. Well, thank you for having me here. And please do call me Surin. It's easier. My name is quite complicated. I understand that. Okay. So without further ado, I will start sharing my screen. And let's hold on a second. Just give me a moment here. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see.
My presentation, yeah? Okay. Well, in that case, if you can see my title of my slides, can I just check if you can see the title of my slides? Sure.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay. All right. In that case, I'd like to begin right now. What I'm talking about today is just giving an overview of, race and gender narratives, and I'm focusing specifically on visual narratives in the representation of superheroes and heroines in both comics and cinema world. All right. So I'm going to be talking a lot about this from now, and I'd like to first of all begin by asking you, what do superheroes and heroines look like? I'm sure in the yesterday from today, you've heard a lot about superheroes and heroines, but what do they look like? We've got Black Panther, we've got Captain Marvel, we've got Captain America, we've got a range of them. There's a lot of diversity in the image that I'm showing you today, but my question here today is, does that diversity actually go out there and show you the true representation of the world that we have out here, and the reaction of the audience to that diversity? Because the audience that goes to watch this is incredibly diverse. However, is that diversity adequately reflected in those particular representations, whether in cinema or on comics? So I'm going to start off with some very brief conceptual notions. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but you may feel free to talk to me about them later. The first things I do is I adopt a whole lot of notions from critical discourse studies as well as multimodal studies. And the first thing I look at is the notion of ideology. Now, Van Dyck from Critical Discourse Studies talks about ideology as a set of beliefs. It's a social representations and social practices which are shared by all group members. And because we share them, it becomes commonplace, it becomes naturalized, and we start accepting them as the way to be, the way to behave, the way to act, the way to practice. So very often these ideologies are expressed in structures of text and talk. And always they influence the ways in which our attitudes are expressed in these texts. So these texts have a dialectical relationship, yeah? They reinforce our ideologies, but our ideologies also shape these particular texts. So in this case, I'm focusing on comics, I'm focusing on cinema, especially the Marvel cinema world, as well as DC cinema world, all right? So these are media texts that I'm focusing on, and in terms of ideology. Then I go to the idea of representation. Well, what is representation? On the simplest level, it is just a depiction of something somewhere. All right. It can be in the form of an image, a photograph, text, whatever. But I'd like to emphasize that there is no true representation of people or events in a text. There's different ways in which people, events, phenomena can be represented, but there is not necessarily one singular representation of that particular event, of that particular person. So media representations are always ways in which the media portrays particular groups, particular communities, experiences, or even topics from very, very specific ideological or value perspectives. And therefore, they ask the audience to understand them in certain preferred ways. Stuart Hall says that when we prepare media text, we encode a particular ideology in it. And so the viewers will either look at it when they're watching that particular film, they will either accept that ideology, the way they decode it, or they challenge it in the way they decode it. So there are preferred ways of understanding particular representations. Now, the key thing here is that all representations contain ideological bias. The people who make them have a particular point of view. And so this ideological bias is contained within these representations. And the more we see these representations repeated, the elements repeated, the more the representations appear to be natural, the more they appear to be accepted, which is how hegemonic ideology works. So when we go to the idea of visual narratives, all right, visual narratives, in this case, these are ways of telling a story. by using visual media, photos, videos, graphics. In this case, we're talking about comics and films, all right? So there is a representational skill. So the link, you have a presentation and then the representation link between narratives, the visual narratives, and our values of reality. The textual and visual narratives will tend to either construct, represent, reinforce, and sustain these ideologically based realities. Now, do understand that they also challenge in many ways, all right? So the ideas of race and gender can be reinforced or challenged through these visual narratives. So having talked about a little bit about the theories and conceptual notions I'm using in my study, let me now go on to the actual meat of my presentation today, all right? Superheroes. Who are superheroes? Well, basically, superheroes are heroes, right? They go out there, they do good. They may be conflicted themselves, but they always go out there to get justice for everybody, all right? To save the world. So very often, the superhero bodies that we see in comics and online, and in cinemas, their bodies are already marked. They are sites of otherness already, all right? So because they're already marked, either they are different in their shape, they're different because of their powers, they are sites of otherness. And in the same way, our race, our ethnicity, and our gender already marks us as sites of otherness depending on particular ideological views of race and gender. So when we watch superheroes, it allows us to embrace our own self, a sense of non-belonging, our sense of otherness. Now, very often, the binary of good versus evil is what superhero values follow. All right. And in this case as well, in the case of our own representation, there are binary views of race, binary views of gender, which we may subscribe to. So very often, the model superhero is held up by the stereotypes of a man. This is the way things are at the moment. The stereotypes of a man equates to the model superhero. So the outside status of the superhero, he's the outsider, right? The other, it's always experienced as entirely white male, and it's always normalized as entirely white male. This is why diversity is a huge issue when we talk about superhero studies, all right? And so when we talk about representation of race and gender, when we just look at Avengers and the Justice League, I just did a very brief, overview of it. And I'm looking at, in terms of gender, it's predominantly male. 70% of the representations in Avengers and Justice League are male. In terms of race, predominantly they are white, all right? And so what happens here is Black characters are backgrounded. There are Black characters, they're only about 10% of them. Other minorities are pretty much marginalized. You have Asians and Latinos, you only see about 2% of them. The indigenous community is completely, almost always erased. You do have some Native Americans, but by and large, they are erased. The LGBTQ community is erased. However, both Marvel and DC always talk about diversity. They always talk about inclusion in comics. And since 2014, they have been making a very sustained effort to include diversity and include different faces, different genders in their superheroes. So DC announced, 24 new titles in 2014 that focus on diversity. They wanted to reinvent the cyborg. And you will see next year, I believe, the cyborg is coming out. They wanted to reinvent Black Canary and Bizarro. These are just some of the things that they have planned to do. So when we talk about representation in superheroes, some of the questions we need to ask is whether the creator and the audience demographics are represented, whether these films are catering to a white ideological market. Are the creators themselves coming from that particular segment of society? Are we giving spaces to female directors, female producers, female cast? Are we giving spaces to people of color in terms of directing, producing, in terms of cast members? And I'm talking about lead, all right, or the majority of the cast. I am not talking about sidekicks and things like that. So in this case here, we talk about which superheroes are privileged, which superheroes are marginalized because of particular ideologies. This leads us then to the notion of underrepresentation and misrepresentation. Very often we find underrepresentations of certain races, certain ethnic groups, and of gender representation. At the same time, we also find misrepresentations. Very often we find the Asian superhero in the Western culture is portrayed through a very Orientalist lens. Women are portrayed through the male lens. So there's misrepresentation as well. However, this is changing. The ideas of the superhero culture is at a turning point right now. You had in 2017, Patty Jenkins, female director, Wonder Woman. You had Ryan Coogler's Black Panther in 2018. You had Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck's Captain Marvel that just came out last year. So these are positive steps forward, but are they enough when we talk about, superheroes? When we talk about comic superheroes, we see a diverse landscape of contemporary superhero media. When we talk about comics, yeah, they are the forefront of diversity. They have females, they have African Americans, they have other kinds of minorities, they have physically disabled, heroes. They have physically different bodied heroes. All right, so they are at the forefront. But is this translated into cinema? Well, our cinematic superheroes, all right, I'm showing you the key ones that are icons for us right now, that are tokens of empowerment for us right now. All right, they are beginning to address cultural erasure in terms of race and gender. All right, and there has been that cultural erasure from a very long time, from the 1940s itself. So because there's a louder demand for non-white and non-male protagonists, you are seeing these particular faces right now. If you think about the whole term Wakanda Forever, it is synonymous with projects of Black empowerment, Black recognition, all right? And Wonder Woman is the first really significant superhero movie with a female lead. Marvel finally had their first female superhero lead with Captain Marvel, all right? However, there is still a lot of room for improvement in cinema versions. Comic books are allowed diversity, they're allowed creativity. Yet when adapted to the screen, there is a lack of progress, all right? There is some progress, but there's still a lot of room for improvement when we talk about these things, okay? So let me give you some examples of how cultural erasure has been redressed over the last few years. When we talk about the figure of Nick Fury, in the original comics, Nick Fury is a white middle-aged guy, all right? Later on, he was, represented by, he was played by David Hasselhoff in 1980s, all right? Who's white male. However, the comics steered towards a black guy, and they modeled it on Samuel L. Jackson, who then played Nick Fury. So today, what we have here is Samuel L. Jackson reflects the early 2000s Marvel comic book character update. But this update is not set on current Earth. It is set in a parallel Earth, all right? So notice it is a parallel Earth. It is not the Earth that we focus on. It is another world, it is another place where the superhero, the Nick Fury is Black. Because of the Marvel cinematic universe, today, only the Black Nick Fury is familiar to the general public. You don't see images of the white middle-aged Nick Fury. You only see images of the Black Nick Fury. And this is because of the recognition, of the conflation of Samuel L. Jackson with the figure of Nick Fury. We then talk about Johnny Storm. Well, Johnny Storm, Michael B. Jordan came through a lot of flack, a lot of aggression online because he was going to be playing Johnny Storm, which has always been, portrayed as a white male, all right? So he faced a lot of aggression. People called it political correctness, because of political correctness, you're putting a black guy in there as, to erase, to rebalance the cultural erasure. However, he himself says that, you know what, you can talk about it as an attempt to meet a racial quota, but you can also look at it as a creative choice. A creative choice by people who are already in interracial relationships, people who are already products of interracial relationships, people who are reflections of what modern families look like, interracial, where race is so ambiguous, so mixed up. There is actually, no sense of privileging just the white race. So Michael B. Jordan actually states something like that. We then go on to the next figure here, who I'm sure you all know who I'm talking about here, the Black Panther. You would have all watched that film. It was a marvelous film. It was actually the very first, figure in comics who's African-American. He started off as not an African-American, just an African superhero. He started off in the comics as a Black character. And then when Marvel Studios finally made the film, they made it with the dominating Black cast. What happened was an original diverse superhero was brought onto the big screen. But what was important here was that his personal heritage, his identity was given prominence. So his blackness was given prominence, his Africanness was given prominence, his power which stemmed from the race, his own race, that was given prominence. And that was something that you didn't see very often, all right? So as he himself said, Black Panther says, I am not a stereotype. I'm not a sidekick. I am myself, and I am the Black Panther. T'Challa says this in response some years back. So what happens is T'Challa becomes an icon of blackness today because there's so little diversity in the Marvel cinematic universe. We go on now to looking at gender erasure, cultural erasure. We talk about Hawk Girl here. Now she talks about, depicting women, and not just white women, colored women, all right? That has to be grounded in reality. She loved Power Rangers. There was no brown girl on Power Rangers. Even when I played with my friends, they were like, you can't be the Pink Ranger, she's a white girl. So she says, you know what, the media is so important here. You have to tell stories yet, but the stories must be grounded in reality. And the reality out there is that the world is a lot more diverse than the cinematic world that we keep putting forward. However, we also still see contradictions, all right? We've got the cultural erasure, where you give prominence to a person of color, all right? In this case here, Aquaman, Jason Momoa, a native Hawaiian, was given prominence to lead the movie, all right? Whereas, representations of Aquaman in the comics have almost always been white blonde males, all right? However, this representation is also complicated because now you have Mira, who's put side by side next to Aquaman, who represents the quintessential male gaze where female superheroes are concerned. Her outfit seems to be for the male gaze. It's rather than it being practical for the purposes of superheroes and superheroines. So there are contradictions involved in redressing cultural erasure itself, all right? Other issues that we come up with, well, the sidekick power. You look at James Rhodes, Tony Stark's best friend, all right? He's a sidekick. He's a black character in his own right. But he has to wear an Iron Man suit, which Tony built for him. His heroics don't stem from himself as a person. They come as a result of the tools that Tony built for him, Tony Stark built for him. So the blackness that is associated with T'Challa's power is not associated with James Rhodes' power, all right? Likewise, when we look at Sam Wilson, the Falcon, all right? Now, in the comics, it was T'Challa, the Black Panther, who created the wings for the Falcon, all right? Yet in the film, no mention of it. It's very impersonal. And what happens is, he makes use of technology that is not actually related to him. He didn't make it. All right. And he comes out second to white superhero partners. So there's some kind of ambivalence here. The power that is given to him comes from the Black Panther, a symbol of black power. All right. But at the same time, he is second to a white superheroes. But I'd like you to ask yourself a question in the next couple of years, when the Falcon now becomes Captain America, because the shield has been given to him. How do you think the Falcon will be conceived? How will he be represented? Will he be represented as a black Captain America, a person of color, a superhero of color, or just the white Captain America reimagined as the Falcon or Sam Wilson? That is something you will need to ask yourself, and we will need to see what happens in the next few years. So there are also mixed messages. Yeah, you've got cultural erasure where the cyborg, DC announced that the cyborg you'll have a black actor, Ray Fisher, starring as the cyborg. This seems very progressive, but the message is really, again, ambivalent. Cyborg as a character is partially covered by metal on his face, his limbs. So the power that makes Cyborg a hero comes from the metal that covers his skin and at the same time hides his race to a certain extent. Again, we go back. This is a difference from T'Challa, all right? This is a particular superhero which is masked to a certain extent. So these are some questions we should be asking ourselves. How is this happening? Why is this happening? What can we do to redress it? We now go on to superheroines. Redressing the gender imbalance. Female superheroes have always been presented as powerful, empowered, equal to the male counterparts. But when we look carefully, what we see are stereotypes. And what we need to ask are, some of the questions that come up is, are the female superheroes actually worthy of male superheroes as worthy? All right. And what do superhero films have to do to be considered as feminist texts? Captain Marvel came out and people have contradicting emotions and reactions to it. Some say it's very feminist. It's very, very post-feminist. It's feminist. It's a progressive thing. Some are saying, no, it's not. It's reinforcing a lot of stereotypes about women. All right. So your question is, what do superhero films have to do to be considered as feminist texts? And the superheroine herself, does she illuminate or embody traits of a male superhero in a female disguise? Or is she a female superhero in her own right? Why is the body of the female superhero scrutinized so much more than any other female character in cinema? You see other kinds of characters, but the female superhero's body is scrutinized, not so much like the male superhero either. So what you have here is the female strength. Is it depicted overtly in the female body? All right. Male superheroes have muscular tones and this and that, but female superheroes are not. Their femininity has to take precedence. Only Elektra, I think, was one of those few female superheroines, and this is many years ago, where you could actually see muscles bulging out of here. In the case of a lot of our current superheroines, their power is invisible. The conventional femininity must be there. It mustn't get disrupted by exertion or by strength. This is why you see, when you look at Wonder Woman, you see femininity and you still have to see strength, but you don't see strength overpowering that femininity, because the question I ask you here is, who is creating these women? Through which lens are these women being seen? All right. So comic superheroines are still a lot more diverse. You've got Kamala Khan, who is an American teenager, who is of mixed Pakistani parentage, who is also partially queer. So she is grappling with the ideas of, who she is as a teenager, who she is as a superhero, her community, her Pakistani community, and things like that. So there's a lot more diversity for Miss Marvel, Kamala Khan, in Echo or Ronin, in Jubilee, as well as other superheroines like Storm and Vixen. All right. So you've got those particular superheroines who are in comics. But the question you will have to ask is, when will a woman of color become the lead of a film? This is a question we still have not answered yet. And the question we need to focus on here is also that the films are still chronicling the perspectives of white women. We're not seeing colored women in these films. So this is where local heroes, Asian heroes, heroines are so important to redress the gender imbalance. All right. So I'd like to show you an example of Thor. All this while, Thor has been male. In Norse mythology, Thor has been male. However, there's been, Marvel has announced that, you're going to have a female Thor. And they've said that this is not a she Thor. This is not a lady Thor. This is not Thorita. This is Thor. This is the Thor of the Marvel universe. And she just happens to be female. All right. So when we look at Thor itself, the hammer of Thor, Mjolnir itself, is gendered. Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. So when Jane Foster picks it up, is it going to change to she be worthy? We will have to ask this question, because Marvel has now decided that a woman is worthy of taking up Thor's mantle. However, her worthiness is still a source of debate in the fandom of comic world. What I've put down there is a quote from some online forums. They talk about the fact that female protagonists are significantly lesser in number than male protagonists. And this is something a lot of fans complain about. Female fans, because they want the characters they can identify with. Male fans, because they want characters they can treat as eye candy. So I can't object to this. Everyone wins. This is what a poster wrote. And what you're seeing here is that although there's an acknowledgement of the need of diversity, there is still that normative view, that assumption that female heroes, superheroines are eye candy. So, that ambivalence is still there, and that is still a big problem for gender imbalance. Let's look at visual narratives of strong female characters, other female characters. You've got Mystique, you've got Scarlet Witch, and you've got the Black Widow. Now, these are women who have been put on screen by men. And then because of that, they're either hypersexualized, they're infantilized, or they lack maternal possibilities. And I will take you through this one by one. If we look at the visual narratives of hypersexualization, and I will talk about Mystique in this, Laura Mulvey talks about the male gaze. She says that, Mainstream Hollywood movies appeal to audiences because they satisfy visual pleasure. And visual pleasure is based on men as active participants, women as passive witnesses to their own objectification. They're objectified, all right? So they're looked at, they're displayed. The role, that is their role. Their appearance is coded for visual and erotic impact, all right? So they are looked at. Knight says that women who are beautiful and draw the male gaze can be coded as powerful. So what happens is sexual power is equated to physical power. However, when they become the object of the male gaze, their agency is lessened. All right, so they're not as agentive as before. So this implicates that gives an implication that female superheroes can only be the femme fatale, and the ability of the female superhero to be dynamic is curtailed, seriously curtailed, because of this whole femme fatale vision. So when we go back to Mystique, Mystique is a villainess in X-Men, and she is actually a villainess in her own right. And yet there is this insistence on depicting her as hyper-sexualized, all right? The Mystique in the comics was never nude. Only the film version regularly represents her as undressed, all right? And the nature of her fighting also is very heavily sexualized. She chokes people with her legs all the time. In fact, the Black Widow wraps her thighs around victims' necks again. So again, this is very sexualized. So when we look at Mystique in the films, we end up as looking at her with something to look at, not something to root for or identify with. And if you look at villains, then there are many antagonists, male antagonists, who we root for. Mystique is almost always seen as needing to be saved, needing to be protected. Whenever she says something, and it's the response is, those are not your words, those are Eric's words. Why can they not be her words as a villainess? All right. As a foil to other superheroines, but no, she needs to be saved from herself in that sense. All right. When we look at the Scarlet Witch, well, Scarlet Witch is one of the most powerful of superheroines in cinemahood. All right. And yet when she's shown she's always shown it's dependent on her brother for comfort, for emotional stability. She cannot control her own amount of power. Her own power is a volatile aspect. They're directly tied to her emotions. And this is the hysterical woman trope that's being used here. They are intelligent and powerful, but they're unbalanced. They need protection. They always need to be rescued. In the Age of Ultron, her brother was her rescuer. In Civil War, the other Avengers protector. In Infinity War, she has to be rescued by Captain America at the very beginning, whereas all the other Avengers are doing other things. Yeah, so they are made to be protected. Then you've got the Black Widow, who is a symbol of power by herself. She's an assassin. She's an accomplished assassin. And yet she falls prey to the ideal that motherhood is very important to female identity. Any woman who's not a mother is marked by an absence of maternalization. So when the Black Widow is sterilized, she says that, you know what, she became a monster. So the implication here is that her inability to conceive made her a monster. Her sterility is the reason she was such a good assassin. So what is happening here is that a connection is being drawn between childlessness and monstrosity, because the normative ideological beliefs of maternalism have to be reinforced. And therefore the superheroine can only be a mean assassin if she is not maternal. She cannot have children. So when we look at the Age of Ultron, I just like to show you these two visuals. At the end, at the final battle scene, every other superhero walks out of there. And yet the two superheroines are carried out of that battle. Ask yourself why. These are two superheroines with vast amounts of power who are very, very capable. And yet they are carried out by others. All right. So when we look at female power, and I'm talking about female power, not necessarily empowerment here, Black Panther is very progressive. It represents different types of women's empowerment, and it shows that Wakanda has an egalitarian society, and women's empowerment, it will strengthen that egalitarian society. Wonder Woman taps into the theme of women's superpowers. It's based on strength, but it's also based on emotions and empathy. But remember that strength is almost always secondary to her femininity, yeah? Captain Marvel also seems to highlight that girls are just as good as boys. Look how far women have come, all right? In this case, Captain Marvel's entire role is that if I shake off my oppression, if I shake off my patriarchal devotion, I end up being a superpower, all right? A superwoman. So I'm coming towards the end now. What we talk about superheroine visual narratives here is that the strong female character is looked on as a symbol of feminism. It gives a space to women, to us, to see ourselves, our bodies on screen. In real life, we know our bodies are strong and capable, but on screen, we are given that opportunity to see that our, superheroines' bodies are also capable, strong. But we'd like to add that, this is a one-dimensional framework. What it prizes is physical strength. It makes attractiveness a requirement, and there's an importance of wearing skin-tight, skimpy, or fetishist gear. These are comments that were made by, I think, Knight. All right. So visual narratives that focus on beauty, on desirability, on sexual powers, what they do is they undermine female strength and the female heroic accomplishment. So the whole idea of girls as good as boys, it measures women empowerment because it compares to men. What happens here is it devalues and trivializes feminine power in its own right. The male perspective is assumed to be universal. And therefore, films are inherently ideological. So the unconscious beliefs and assumptions that are held and practices that inform our everyday lives give us a false or limited perception of reality and reinforce harmful gender stereotypes. So we come to the conclusion here. Superheroes have a significant cultural power, all right? But we need to ask ourselves, what are the cultural understandings of superheroes? Do they encompass race and gender completely fully, or are they still very, very restricted and limited? Race and gender in superhero visual narratives. How do the underrepresentation and misrepresentation of race and gender affect the cultural definition of heroism itself? We need to ask this particular questions. I'm not answering these questions. These are things that we need to think about as we move forward, looking at superheroes. And the concept of a superhero. Is it limited to specific race, gender, or sexuality? Are superheroines there as characters in their own rights, or are they only there to show that women are just as good as men? Are they token empowerment? We need to ask these questions. So while we are celebrating superheroes who are women, or while we are celebrating superheroes who are colored, we need to ask, are they token empowerments, or are they actually powerful in their own right? And at the end, we need to ask one particular question. Who cannot be a superhero? Why can't Asian superheroes be given a lead in any particular film? Why are they still being seen through Orientalist lenses? And why is there an absence of LGBTQ figures in cinematic world? In comics, you do have some allusions to it, but not in cinematic world. So with that, I leave you with these particular questions, and I welcome any questions that you yourself may have. Thank you very much.